Welcome to this explainer. Okay, picture the scene for a second. Millions of people are screaming at their TVs, painting their faces, and feeling literally emotionally destroyed because a group of adult strangers failed to move a piece of leather across a line of white chalk. Meanwhile, right next to them sits a completely apathetic observer who feels absolutely nothing. It's a pretty stark contrast, right? Well, today we're going to unpack exactly why that happens. If you're that person who just kind of zones out when the big game comes on, society might have told you that you're boring or, lacking passion. But as we'll see today, the psychology of people who don't love sports is totally different. And honestly, the neuroscience behind it is absolutely fascinating.
Just consider the massive gap between these two minds. On one hand, you've got the euphoric sports fan. They're highly tribal, deeply emotionally invested, and eagerly chasing this external narrative. On the other hand, you have the indifferent non-fan. This person tends to be highly individualistic, totally detached from the spectacle, and they're really just seeking personal meaning somewhere else. Society loves to label non-fans as lazy or contrarian, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Their brains aren't malfunctioning. They're simply processing meaning, reward, and connection in a completely different way than the diehard fanatic.
Think about it like this. Roughly 60% of Americans follow sports religiously. That's a huge, clear majority. But that leaves a massive chunk of us, 40% of the population, who are entirely indifferent. So if you fall into that 40%, you are not broken. You just don't experience the exact same chemical reactions when the referee blows the whistle. Your biological circuitry is simply tuned to a completely different frequency. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The neuroscience of fandom. 2. Why your brain unplugs. 3. The 4 types of non-fans. And 4. Where your energy actually goes. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The neuroscience of fandom, or what we can call the biological hardware. To really understand the non-fan, we kind of have to understand what happens to the fan first. For thousands of years, human survival depended on being part of a tribe, right? Well, sports are essentially our modern tribes. When a fan watches their team, their brain literally releases oxytocin, which tricks them into feeling this deep, kin-like bond with a bunch of millionaire strangers. Plus, they get hooked into an intermittent reinforcement loop. It goes like this. First, anticipation builds before the play. Next comes the uncertainty of what's going to happen. And third, the reward of a good outcome. This unpredictable cycle just floods a fan's brain with dopamine, activating the exact same reward centers as a slot machine. Every single play is a microdose of anticipation and reward that just keeps them hooked. But what about the non-fan? Well, people who don't care about sports naturally possess lower tribal instincts. There's actually a really fascinating 2019 study that found individuals with low sports interest exhibited significantly reduced us versus them thinking. They simply don't automatically hate another group just because they happen to be wearing a different colored jersey. On top of that, research from the University of Chicago suggests this indifference might literally be hardwired into your DNA, specifically through genetic variations in your dopamine receptors. Non-fans simply aren't triggered by vicarious competition. This biological difference leads to a wild psychological phenomenon called burging, or basking in reflected glory. You know when a team wins and fans say, "We won," but then when they lose, they immediately switch to "they lost"? That's burging. People who don't watch sports rarely engage in this kind of psychological distancing. Instead, their self-concept remains highly stable and independent. They just don't need an external, totally uncontrollable victory by a sports team to feel successful in their own lives.
Moving on to Section 2, Why Your Brain Unplugs, Shifting to the Software.
Now that we've covered the biological hardware, let's talk about the psychological software. Have you ever felt completely alienated at a Super Bowl party? Everyone around you is losing their minds and you're just standing there waiting for the guacamole to be refilled? Well, you're experiencing what's called value dissonance. This is when society finds deep pleasure in something that your brain simply does not respond to. And it's so important to understand that experiencing value dissonance is not arrogance, it's not you being lazy, and it's not some edgy rebellion against popular culture. Value dissonance simply means your mind is highly self-aware of exactly where its limited energy and focus actually belong. Your brain just flat out refuses to fire its excitement circuits for an outcome you can't control.
So where does a non-fan's energy go instead? Well, a 2021 study revealed that non-fans don't lack empathy at all, they just allocate it differently. Look, everybody has a limited capacity for deep care. While fans pour it into their teams, non-fans direct their empathy towards social causes, personal relationships, creative projects, intellectual challenges, and art. They actually score much higher in openness to experience. They're still getting their emotional highs. They're just finding them in a gallery, a book, or a relationship, rather than out on a field.
Section 3. 4 types of non-fans. Let's see if you can find your reflection here. Psychologists have observed that people who don't watch sports pretty consistently fall into one of 4 distinct psychological archetypes. As we go through these, try to see which one sounds like you. The first archetype is the self-focused thinker. Their inner monologue is basically always asking, why should I care about people I don't even know? When a stadium erupts in cheers, this person's brain just isn't wired for that vicarious emotion. They don't get a thrill from watching someone else succeed. They get their dopamine hit from building and achieving things themselves. This type has incredibly low needs for external validation and extremely high self-determination. They value personal progress way more than public spectacle. Now, from the outside, passionate sports fans might view this type as cold or aloof. But in reality, they're just independent thinkers. They don't need a shared, manufactured emotion to feel like they belong to a community. They're seeking genuine self-improvement instead. Next up is the disillusioned observer, who was driven by this stark realization: cheering won't fix my problems, and celebrating strangers won't fill my emptiness. What's super unique about this group is that a lot of them actually used to care. They used to watch every single game. But at some point, something shifted. They looked past the grass and the ball, and they saw the money, the marketing, and ultimately, the illusion of it all. Psychologically speaking, this observer has experienced existential detachment. This happens when entertainment stops feeling meaningful because it lacks real depth, growth, or purpose. And it's crucial to note that this person didn't step back out of bitterness or arrogance. They stepped back out of profound awareness. They simply rejected the illusion that the game matters more than their actual life. Our third archetype is the redirected mind. This person says, I don't lack passion. I just direct it toward worlds that feel alive to me. This type doesn't inherently dislike sports. They just don't need them. Their excitement requires active participation. They're directing their intense passion toward complex video games, deep film analysis, building cars, or maybe composing music. The redirected mind features diversified stimulation patterns. Their reward system absolutely demands novelty and interactivity. To this brain, watching sports feels entirely passive and highly repetitive. I mean, it's literally just a ball going back and forth on grass, right? But a complex game, a brilliant film, or mastering a new skill, that provides their brain with the novelty, mastery, and connection it craves all at once. They get immense joy from personal relevance. Finally, we have the honest realist, driven by a pretty blunt question: why watch millionaires kick a ball while I am still building my own life? For this person, the massive spectacle of sports is not a fun escape. Instead, it serves as a stark and maybe somewhat painful reminder of their own unreached goals or current struggles. This behavior is actually a highly practical form of emotional self-protection. It's the conscious choice not to invest energy into something that gives absolutely nothing back. The honest realist sees the world through a lens of strict practicality. And, this perspective isn't cynical and it isn't bitter. It is pure psychological honesty. Why pour your limited emotional reserves into watching someone else live their dream when you are trying to build your own? And finally, Section 4, where your energy goes, the empowering synthesis. When we synthesize all of this, the biology, the value dissonance, and those 4 archetypes, we uncover a really powerful realization about human energy. Researchers contrast 2 distinct states: parasocial investment versus direct engagement. Sports fans heavily utilize parasocial investment. It's a one-sided spectatorship, essentially living a compelling drama through others. Non-fans, however, fiercely prefer direct engagement. They want reciprocity. They want participation. They want to be the main character building their own narrative, not just a spectator in the stands of someone else's story. Neither is inherently superior, but they are entirely different strategies for navigating the human experience. And this brings us to the concept of flow states, which was famously studied by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Flow is that optimal experience of complete total absorption. While a fan might find flow passively watching a 3-hour Sunday broadcast, a non-fan achieves it through countless other active, engaging pursuits. Because they aren't spectating someone else's struggle for hours on end, non-fans consistently report feeling vastly more present in their own day-to-day lives. They are fully engaged in their own arena. So, I'm going to leave you with this. Which of those 4 types are you, and where are you playing your own game? If you don't care about sports, you aren't missing out on some fundamental human experience. Your reward system, your empathy allocation, and your tribal instincts are just calibrated differently. You aren't broken, and you certainly aren't boring. You're simply playing a different game, one with much higher personal stakes. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep building your own narrative.